Welcome to the Greener Grass podcast from BlueBird Botanicals. I'm your host, Lex Pelger. Today we sit down in the office of Dr. Cinnamon Bidwell. She's a researcher at CU Boulder who focuses on translational research, connecting the known biochemistry of drugs to the health outcomes of patients. She studies drugs like cannabis, tobacco, and alcohol to investigate abuse potentials and therapeutic effects. Her research has been used to criticize the quality of cannabis from the federal grow operation at the University of Mississippi, and their group also created the infamous DAB-van. It's a mobile research facility that allows them to work around the research prohibitions by having participants ingest cannabis in their own home and then get tested in a van that pulls up out front. Dr. Bidwell works with CU Reach, the Center for Research and Education addressing cannabinoids and health. You can see links to their research in the episode notes, as well as ways to help fund their research into the real-world effects of cannabis. This show is brought to you by BlueBird Botanicals, to spread education about cannabis and other things on the greener side of life. BlueBird CBD oil comes from farms in southern Colorado and is grown using only water, soil, and sunlight. Go to bluebirdbotanicals.com for more info. Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm here with Dr. Cinnamon Bidwell.
Hi, thanks. Before
we talk more about what you're doing right now, I was just curious what got you into science in the first place?
Definitely. I would say it's been a love of learning and a curiosity pretty much throughout my life. And my first experiences working in research were as an undergrad at Tufts University. And I was just really compelled by the scientific process and the structure around formulating questions and finding answers. And it just fascinated me in terms of the links between brain and behavior. And ultimately it led to a PhD in clinical psychology and with a focus on neuroscience and genetics. And then a research career studying the impact of substances of abuse on mental health and brain and behavior. And
it's a really tricky intersection that you're at, to be studying emotions and actual effects that people do, and then the genetics and the molecular things going underneath.
Absolutely. And I think it's one of the most exciting things about research is actually studying real world phenomenon, and human behavior is very complex. And, for me, the most exciting piece is to integrate all those pieces and to pull in experts who may be purely neuroscientists or purely molecular biologists, but to be kind of the person who can communicate and pull those pieces all in to answer the big questions and help us understand human health and human brain function and human behavior. That's ultimately where kind of the excitement lies for me.
And so then how did drug dependence start to become a field that was of interest?
Definitely. So my training started as a clinical psychologist. So essentially trying to understand mental illness, understand risk for mental illness from a biological and environmental background. And then ultimately, how do we treat and improve lives for people who suffer from mental illness? And throughout that process and that training, it became very clear to me, both on the research side as well as in my work with actual patients and families, that substance use was a very large component of people's lives, of people's histories, particularly those who suffered from mental illness. And so trying to understand that connection that I had seen with my eyes in my clinical life, trying to understand it from the biological links, the multiple influences on brain and behavior became a research goal. And so we know that people with mental illness have greater risk for using different substances. It also is a complicator for treatment of their mental illnesses. And so broadly, this led me down the path of trying to understand why and how to help people who suffered from that.
And it seemed like some of your earlier research was on ADHD and around schizophrenia, and there's just so much going on there with drugs and how they can help sometimes and hurt sometimes, and so much of that is dosage and setting.
Definitely. Yeah, and it's not really surprising that the parts of the brain and the parts of our genetic backgrounds that put us at risk for things like ADHD or schizophrenia or affective disorders are the same parts that overlap with the use of substances. So the parts of the brain that are involved with these very complex human emotions and very complex human cognitive processing dynamics are also those impacted by substances. And so that overlap on a neural level is really what's helped us understand addiction as a brain disorder, but it also speaks to a need to understand kind of the overlapping aspects across those two.
And so you're looking at addiction as a brain disorder, and it's a really forward-thinking place to be from where we've been the last couple of decades. But do you get any pushback from some of the groups today who are involved in addiction who sometimes dislike the brain disorder view of looking at this?
Well, I do think the idea of it just being a brain disorder it's an oversimplification. And so one of the things I absolutely strive for in my work is to embrace the complexity and not oversimplify. I think the idea that the brain is involved is absolutely unrefutable, and that's a fairly recent idea, but that we can go too far in the sense that it's deterministic, or that your biology sets you down a path that you can't recover from. And I don't believe that at all. There's a lot of interacting influences from environment, from underlying biology that then also even impacts how the brain develops and how the vulnerabilities may either increase or decrease based on your life experience, your exposures. So it's way more complex than it just being a brain disorder. And when we talk about that publicly and scientifically, it's really careful to embrace those nuances.
And so now can you tell me more about CU Reach and how it came to be and what you're working on?
Absolutely. So through my path of really being focused on the impact of substances of abuse and mental health, I've worked in the areas of nicotine and tobacco, as well as alcohol and cannabis. The last few years has really been a very specific and targeted focus on cannabis, particularly because as legalization started kind of sweeping the country, starting with Colorado in 2012 to 2014, it really became clear to me that science was not able to contribute to that conversation in a way that was really meaningful. And a lot of that has to do with the federal restrictions on cannabis, the Schedule I status of cannabis, really limiting research and the information that research can provide, both in terms of the risks and potential harms of legalization or high potency products, but also in terms of the potential benefits of different cannabinoids in a host of medical conditions. And so it became very clear to me as I was a researcher in Colorado with expertise in this field that this was an area that was desperately in need of data. And I was excited to figure out ways to address that gap and maybe some novel approaches to do the research that still complied with all these regulations, but started to provide data that could actually contribute to personal decisions. Because of legalization, the cart is way before the horse. People are out there using these products, potentially believing there's some scientific basis for the decisions they're making, but without a large body of literature to back it up. So I became excited to try to assist with that process. And living in Colorado was a unique opportunity because we have legalized cannabis, which creates, a unique opportunity to be able to contribute to this knowledge gap. And so through that, I started to build an observational research program to study cannabis in terms of both health effects and risks. I have great collaborators here, Dr. Kent Hutchinson and Angela Bryan in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience. And the three of us have really, over the last 4 years, really been working hard to build up this program. But then it became very clear, too, that there's other researchers around campus who are facing some of the same barriers, interested in the same ultimate goals, but maybe approach it from different angles. So plant biologists, for example, trying to understand the genetics of the plant, information scientists trying to understand the way that information about cannabis is disseminated from all the way from plant material to public perception. And then, more traditional twin or genetic research on trying to understand the risk of cannabis. So there's all these different groups on campus, and we're all kind of facing some of the same barriers and ultimately have the same goal, which is to contribute knowledge to this area that is desperately in need of knowledge. And so with that, we developed a center, which is CU Reach, Research and Education Addressing Cannabinoids in Health, with the goal of kind of bringing all of these, all of the different arms of cannabis research on campus under one umbrella to help improve not only the research we were doing and collaboration, but also a huge component of education and outreach, and so that we would be able to more effectively disseminate and share the information that we're learning from our research, because that's ultimate goal is to is for that research to be useful to the public. So that was kind of how it came. Yeah.
It's very exciting to have this going on right here. And so what were some of the first research and findings that you got to finish and put out there?
Right. So we've recently published what was sort of our first attempt at studying legal market cannabis. And to kind of back up a little bit, because of federal restrictions, as an adult in Colorado, I can legally purchase and go to a dispensary, and I can legally purchase any form of cannabis that's legally sold on our market, right? But as a scientist, as a researcher, even at CU in Colorado with state laws that have legal recreational cannabis, I could not bring that cannabis directly on campus to study. So we can't study the effects of legal market cannabis. Our nation's top physiologists or biochemists can't actually analyze that cannabis. So we really have this bizarre gap where if it were alcohol, I could go through all of my normal ethical and human subjects approvals, get my funding, but I would ultimately be able to bring it into my lab and study it in a controlled way. And but because of the gap between state and federal laws, we can't do that with cannabis, leading to this huge data gap that I referred to earlier. But so one of the goals of the research program is to actually study legal market cannabis, both the risks and the benefits. And so our first attempt at this was a pilot study that we started about 4 years ago and was just recently published in a journal called Cannabis and Cannabinoid Research. And essentially it was our first attempt to see can we even do this? Can we study legal market cannabis in a way that still has elements of experimental rigor? So it's not just purely observational of people being out there in the world. But essentially what we were able to do with that and what we're able to really launch our research program with was we started with this very small study where we asked people to go to a dispensary and buy either a normal THC, a normal sort of average THC strain, or a strain that was kind of a 1-to-1 THC CBD strain. And we asked them to purchase it, use it, and immediately after use, we rushed them to the lab for an assessment to try to see whether there were different effects between kind of the traditionally research has really focused on the harm of THC. So after people use THC, there's acute impairment, there's acute intoxication. So THC is really sort of flagged as this potentially harmful component that can lead to addiction and also negative cognitive outcomes. And so our question really is if you take people who typically use a THC-based strain and you assign them to a strain that contains CBD, what happens kind of acutely? And the only way we're able to do that is if they themselves purchase it, we don't touch it, we don't dose it because of federal laws. And so we constructed this pilot study that essentially allowed us to verify by then measuring people's blood immediately after they use that they did use the product we asked them to use. So people who were assigned the THC-based product only had THC in their blood. Those who were assigned the strain that also contained CBD had both THC and CBD in their blood. And we could tell, yes, you actually did what we asked you to do, even though we didn't give it to you. And then ultimately the responses were different. The impairment, the THC-related impairment was not as strong in the individuals who had been assigned to the CBD-containing strain. So the cognitive outcomes were people were less impaired, people were less subjectively high. So this data suggests that some of our hypotheses may be accurate, and that it's really important to start to test strains that actually contain the amounts of THC and CBD that are available on the real market. And so at this point, it's a lot of hearsay and anecdote, but we don't have a large body of research to suggest that, what happens when people administer both THC and CBD. And so we're starting to move in that direction. And we also looked at the impact of THC versus the combination of THC and CBD on inflammation markers in the blood. Inflammation markers are really relevant in terms of stress response, as well as conditions like chronic pain and other conditions that people tend to use medical cannabis for. And so our pilot data also looked at that and showed that there were differences. And so that paves the way for some of the work we're doing on the health side. So if these cannabinoids have different impacts when they're administered alone or together on inflammation, that could have to do with how they ultimately impact conditions like chronic pain. And so this very small pilot study sort of paved the way for a bunch of large studies that we're doing now focused on the impact of different cannabinoids on health and behavior.
Whew. So some good souls volunteered to get themselves high and then come in for their blood draws.
Definitely.
And
yes.
testing.
Yes.
Good for them.
Yeah.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
And with the blood testing, it would be in more accurate form than what most people would get, because then you'd be testing just for the active metabolites, not like some other lousy testing methods that are out there.
So when you say lousy, what are you thinking of?
The urine tests that are testing for
yeah.
THC-11 and things like that.
Right. And, the urine tests aren't going to necessarily give you a good, what we call pharmacokinetic curve in terms of the drug exposure. We have pretty solid blood data that from lab studies that should show you what should the THC curve really look like when people use, and what should the metabolite curve look like after people use. And so we can use that to kind of map on our more observational data to those curves. But our blood, we collect data on about a dozen different cannabinoids and relevant metabolites that really can precisely map onto the acute peak curve, and then as THC starts to drop off, some of the metabolites start to pick up, right? Because it's quickly converted to things like THC-CoO and THC hydroxy, things like that. So, which are relevant in terms of effects and differ across regular users or non-regular users.
And so when you talk about cognitive effects from THC, as someone who's obviously not against cannabis overall, but is honest about the harms, what are some of the things that most concern you with high levels of THC use, especially for, say, teenagers?
Right. I think the data are fairly strong to suggest that delaying use is a pretty good idea. Early use, heavy use, and again, this is correlational data because no study is going to assign a teenager to use cannabis or not. So these are not able to speak to a direct causal effect of cannabis. But when I look overall at the literature, there does seem to be increased risk with early and heavy use. If you really dissect that and look at other kind of family influences or influences of substance use, you can account for some of that risk. So, some of the really scary studies that say, 20-point difference in IQ from starting in adolescence, probably that is overly hyped. But if you carefully dissect the literature, I think we've moved beyond Nancy Reagan, who, just say no, but the data are pretty compelling to say, just say not yet. And in terms of impact on the brain, in terms of risks like mental health risks like schizophrenia, some of those risks appear to be there and also influenced by other things, including your genetic background. But there does seem to be a story there with cannabis. But on the other hand, we don't have we're really strong data to suggest a very clear causal effect, but I would suggest caution. I think we don't. On the other hand, we also don't have data to suggest that moderate use or adult use is really associated with those same kind of risks, and so that delaying start and using more moderately, we don't have data to suggest that that's an extremely risky situation. Yeah.
And so how did you move on from those initial studies to refine them and to get them more accurate data for what you were trying to figure out?
Right. And so we're actually in that mode right now. So we're in data collection with larger studies that involve multiple different forms of cannabis and specific health conditions. With larger studies and more money, you're able to assess more people and ask more questions. And so we're specifically interested in things like what happens when individuals with chronic pain initiate cannabis use, what happens to their pain, what happens to their associated inflammatory function, which I told you about, but then also their use of other medications, so opiate use, other pain medications that they may have been on for a long time, and clearly also pose a harm. If you're thinking about sort of the costs and benefits, you can't just think about the potential harms of starting cannabis, but what are the potential harms of being on opiates for 20 to 30 years, things like that. So we've moved on to some of these more complex patient populations where we really need to dial it in. The other innovation that we've had, we're able to achieve funding through the National Institute on Drug Abuse to fund what we're calling our mobile lab. And so our mobile lab allows us to really advance the research in that rather than having to rush people back to the lab like we did in our pilot study after they used, we're able to actually go to them and meet them at their home. And the mobile lab is a fully outfitted Dodge Sprinter van that essentially has all the equipment that we would use to assess people if they were in the lab. So we can assess people on cognitive function, physiological functions, motor control, many of their health symptoms if it's a health population. And we can do all those assessments right in the mobile lab. And what that allows us to do is to assess them both before and after they use. So that same day assessment really adds a lot of control to our research, and then also shortens the time in which they're between when they use and when we can actually assess them for those acute effects. So we're able to get control kind of on both sides with the mobile lab, and that's really advanced our research program to still maintain that observational element where we are not actually watching them use or administering the cannabis, but we're able to pull in as many of the elements of laboratory control as we can with the mobile lab.
That is really exciting. Have that running all over Boulder County, I guess.
Pretty much, yeah. It's pretty busy. The van is out there collecting data pretty much every day for these different studies. So yeah, it's an exciting time. Yeah.
Is it hard to find participants?
We have not really struggled at this point. I think what I notice is that people kind of implicitly understand this need for data, and we get people who are really excited to participate, contribute their data. They have to go through a lot to participate in the study, and they're purchasing their own cannabis. It's very naturalistic. They're using it as they normally would, but they put time into doing it. They have to follow instructions, and they're really willing to be very compliant in order for us to collect the best data possible. Because without that piece, then our data is messy. And so we have really excited, compliant participants. And at this point, I think at this point the van is overbooked. We literally have people waiting to participate because we have so much exciting research going on in the lab. So yeah.
How often do you get to hear research scientists say that?
I know. It's a lucky place to be, for sure. Yeah.
And what are some of the cognitive tests that are most useful for you?
Yeah, so I think it's important to keep in mind, the cannabis literature is so interesting. And as somebody who's interested in the effects of drugs on the brain, cannabis is kind of unlike, let's say, alcohol, where you get many more global effects of alcohol. Once intoxication is on board, there's a lot of cognitive functions that start to become disrupted, whereas cannabis is more selective. particularly in regular users. You don't get just across the board cognitive impairment across different types of function. But one of the main areas that's been replicated, even for lower potency cannabis, is different forms of memory function. And so we pay very careful attention to that in the lab, and have multiple assessments of memory that we use in the van. And both from the side of the question of, if people are using very high potency cannabis, does this effect worsen, or does the recovery take longer? Whereas with a lower potency form, potentially, is it less or recovering more quickly? That's a question people want to know the answer to if they're deciding to use higher potency cannabis, right? And then on the other side, for, let's say, a medical patient, a cancer patient who's deciding to use cannabis to cope with their side effects from their treatment, or to assist with their pain or nausea, they would want to know, kind of, is there a combination of cannabinoids that helps with my symptoms, but also doesn't result in a memory function that's so impaired that I have trouble complying with my treatment regimens, or organizing the rest of my life, those kinds of things. And so those are the goals with the types of data that we're collecting, is that it's really important to people to understand both sides of the coin when they're initiating or making choices about the type of cannabis they use or the context in which they use it. As a scientist who's really interested in actual empirical data, we know that some of the things that people think are good for them, or things that people experience, don't necessarily hold up when put under the lens of experimental paradigm. And so our goal is to really contribute to that knowledge, and actually contribute to that knowledge with empirical data, rather than just basing it on individual or anecdotal experience.
I do like my anecdotes.
Yeah.
That's very good.
No anecdotes allowed.
Well, on that vein, are there, for any of these tests, do people do better with cannabis or higher potency cannabis of the tests you do?
So that's a good question. So we have one study that's focused on really looking at the effects of high potency concentrates. And what I was explaining to you, because of federal restrictions, we really have no data on the impact of these products, whether it's vodka versus beer, people titrate, whether or not the intoxication or impairment is worse. And so we are actually finding there aren't a lot of differences in terms of the acute effects, at least preliminarily, that can exactly track potency. So higher potency doesn't necessarily mean more impairment, but we are seeing greater THC exposure in the blood for these higher potency products, so high potency concentrates, which suggests that there may be neuroadaptations going on, or complicated processes when people are trying to stop or come off of concentrates, that their biology may have shifted because of having to adjust that to that very high THC exposure. So it's a complicated picture, and we're trying to tease it all out. And I think part of the message is that we're not seeing necessarily acutely much greater impairment, but that some of the physiological changes that might be happening may be concerning or informative when it comes to use of high potency concentrates.
And those concentrates, they're also known as dabs out there as well. And so your team is some of the first ever looking at this kind of stuff. Has there been any pushback for looking at this kind of hard liquor of the cannabis world?
I think people are really excited, and that study is actually funded by the state of Colorado. So my understanding, at least, is that the tax dollars from the Marijuana Enforcement Division and the medical or the recreational cannabis tax dollars and things will go towards funding research in the state. And they've had a couple calls for research studies, and we've gotten funded to do one of them, which is this concentrate study, this dabbing study. And I think everyone's really excited, and I think our lab has this really unique design in which we rely on the mobile lab, and we're really the only people who can do it, who can collect data, because without this, not that other people couldn't use the same design, but without this design and without the mobile lab, you you couldn't legally collect these kinds of data. So we're the first ones that are doing it. We're looking at, like I said, the impact on cognitive function, motor control, whether there's any differences in terms of simulated driving ability, mood response, blood levels, all kinds of things. And I think because we're open to sort of the outcome being, we're very interested to see what the data tell us. It could really go either way. So we're excited. Yeah.
What are some of the biggest barriers to research that would help you if they were removed or altered in this field?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's hard to answer that because it's sort of, what do you think is a realistic barrier that could be removed? Like the dare to dream situation. I think, when Obama was in office, we sort of had this idea that, similarly to the Cole memo, so the Cole memo kind of took the pressure off the states in terms of the cannabis laws, in terms of the DEA coming in and enforcing federal laws. We always hoped that there would sort of be a similar memo that was specific to researchers, and so that we would have the protection that if you lived in a state with legal market cannabis, that you could be free to study that according to your state law. And that we wouldn't have this bizarre contradiction where, as a citizen of my state, I can purchase and use, but as a researcher in my state, I can't study it in the way that my training allows me to do. So we always kind of had that idea that, I strongly believe that the research should really inform the policy decisions, and that we need data kind of on both sides of the aisle in terms of what are really the harms and what are the benefits, as I've said, and only good quality research can tell us that. And so my hope had been to kind of have that be the first step, even before a schedule status change or before a federal law change related to cannabis legalization, but to first sort of allow researchers to do their thing. I find that very unlikely that would happen. And I don't know what the possible path would be in terms of, I feel like probably the federal law, the only way for us to change and be able to do research differently is if there's a change in federal law, which is probably not super likely either. Yeah.
And so despite those limitations, what parts of the field are you most excited about coming up these next few years, where you think things are going to start unfolding?
Yeah, I think it's happening. It's already happening. I think people are understanding the need for the research and how quickly we can move the needle, even through these more observational designs. So yeah, we can't do a randomized controlled trial of chronic pain patients who initiate cannabis use, but we have enough animal data and we have enough other hints that a design like ours, that even though it doesn't meet all of these boxes in terms of a randomized controlled trial, can provide really compelling data. What happens in the real world when people use real world cannabis to treat their pain? And our studies will provide that. There's a lot of cool data coming out of Canada right now with their changes in their laws. So they can do really full-on randomized controlled trials, which will help provide data on the impact of different cannabinoids. I think the research is starting to catch up. We're also starting to do better on the molecular level. We're also starting to collect better data. So starting to be able to detect terpenes in the blood and multiple cannabinoids and things that actually contribute to potentially effects on both sides. And so I think, although it's still challenging to do the research and a lot of people are deterred because of the restrictions, the momentum is building. And I think, because legalization is so widespread, people understand there's a huge need. And
so for people who do understand that, for the last question, how can people support your work that you're doing here, whether they're close by or farther away?
Yeah, so we are always interested in participants. People can go to our website, which is the CU Change Lab. You can Google us, the CU Change Lab at the University of Colorado. We've got tons of research studies going on if anybody wants to participate. We also have some targeted funding campaigns going on, trying to build up the funding for the REACH Center, which I talked about earlier, which is the multidisciplinary center trying to promote cannabis research and education locally and nationally, and as well as we're trying to promote a funding campaign for our mobile lab and for our specific program of research to help build that up and give us more flexibility around collecting the data more quickly, and getting answers to these burning questions as quickly as possible.
Thank you so much. So if anyone out there wants to help these researchers or out there getting their hands dirty and learning things, we'll have links in the episode notes about all the ways you can help. Thank you, Dr. Bidwell, so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Greener Grass is a BlueBird Botanicals podcast. Their CBD oil supports a healthy body and a strong endocannabinoid system. They've got friendly customer service who can answer any of your questions, and the number is right there at the top of their webpage. But, per the FDA, they won't be able to make any medical claims for these nutritional supplements. That's also the reason you'll hear little about CBD on this show. There's no need for us to add more evidence about CBD when a simple Google search will give you more than you can read in a month of Sundays. So this show covers the cannabis world and more with editorial freedom from BlueBird Botanicals. Thanks for joining the Greener Grass podcast. As always, our audio alchemist is Matt Payne. The Gypsy Jazz theme music comes from Brett Van Donsel. Our beautiful bird sounds are courtesy of Lang Elliott. And I'm your host, Lex Pelger, wishing you a bright green day.